Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Social Security, labor rights, and the limits of the New Deal. The core question is this: who counts as a worker worth protecting when Congress turns emergency relief into permanent law for old age, job loss, and collective bargaining? The core competency is to outline the tenets of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Depression-era economic agenda. Who counts as a worker worth protecting when Congress turns emergency relief into permanent law for old age, job loss, and collective bargaining? By 1935, the New Deal had moved beyond immediate bank rescue and short-term unemployment relief toward a deeper question of whether democratic government should guarantee some measure of economic security. The answer came through social insurance, labor law, and a new administrative relationship between workers and the national state. Unlike the CCC or WPA, these measures created continuing claims written into statute. The later New Deal shifted federal responsibility from temporary intervention toward ongoing protection. The Social Security Act and the Wagner Act established payroll taxes, benefit formulas, bargaining rules, labor board procedures, and enforcement systems meant to outlast a single downturn. Washington was no longer saying only that it would help in catastrophe. It was saying that law itself would recognize regular claims tied to age, employment, and union rights. That promise remained selective from the beginning. Congressional compromise, racial hierarchy, gender assumptions, and administrative convenience shaped who counted as a standard worker. Industrial wage earners gained major protections, while agricultural laborers, domestic workers, many women, many Black Southerners, and many Mexican-American workers were left outside the core system. The later New Deal, therefore, began as creation and exclusion at the same time. Before 1935, older Americans without savings or family support often depended on local poor relief, charity, mutual aid societies, or continued labor beyond their physical capacity. Unemployment relief also remained uneven and frequently humiliating. County officials could investigate households, cut payments, or deny assistance based on residence rules and local budgets. The Depression exposed the weakness of that arrangement. When millions lost jobs at once, the older patchwork of relief and private support failed to provide predictable protection. Pressure for a more permanent solution grew from several directions. Dr. Francis Townsend's old age pension movement attracted enormous popular support by proposing generous federal pensions financed through a national sales tax. Huey Long's Share Our Wealth program demanded wealth redistribution and attacked concentrated fortune. Labor unrest intensified in mass production industries, showing that wages and unemployment were tied to workplace power as much as to relief budgets. Roosevelt's administration did not adopt Townsend's or Long's full programs, but their popularity demonstrated the political demand for something stronger than temporary aid. The Committee on Economic Security, created by Roosevelt in 1934, became the main planning body for a federal solution. Labor Secretary Francis Perkins played a central role. The committee examined European social insurance models, state unemployment systems, payroll structures, and American constitutional constraints. Its work turned the idea of security into a legislative design problem. How would benefits be financed? Which workers would be covered? Would the federal government administer programs directly or in partnership with the states? These questions shaped the final statute as much as moral arguments did. Business groups, conservative Democrats, and fiscal caution also shaped the design. Many lawmakers doubted that a broad pension paid from general revenue could survive either politically or constitutionally. Payroll taxes appeared more defensible because workers and employers would contribute through a visible, earnings-based stream. That choice made the program sturdier in public debate, but it also tied protection tightly to formal wage records and covered employment categories. The administrative design followed that logic closely. Title VIII imposed payroll taxes on employers and employees, with collections scheduled before monthly old age benefits would begin in 1940. Federal and state officials needed wage records, account numbers, employer reporting systems, and claims procedures capable of handling millions of workers who had never before been entered into a national insurance ledger. In 1936 and 1937, the Social Security Board oversaw the distribution of application forms and the creation of numbered accounts on a scale that itself signaled a new relationship between households and the federal state. Labor policy traveled alongside social insurance. Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act had briefly encouraged union organizing, but enforcement was weak and industrial conflict intensified. San Francisco longshoremen, Minneapolis Teamsters, and Toledo Autolite workers all struck in 1934. These confrontations demonstrated that unemployment and wages could not be separated from bargaining power. A government serious about economic stability had to decide whether workers would meet employers as isolated individuals or through legally protected collective organization. Frances Perkins carried into the New Deal the memory of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and years of labor reform work in New York. As Secretary of Labor, she pushed for a system that would protect workers from the insecurity exposed by the Depression. Her role in the Committee on Economic Security helped convert reform goals into concrete legislative provisions. The Social Security Act of August 1935 included old age insurance, unemployment compensation administered with state participation, and aid categories for dependent children, the blind, and some vulnerable elderly people. Payroll contributions and employer taxes became the fiscal mechanism behind the new system. Structure was divided into titles with different administrative logic. Title II established old age benefits tied to covered employment and payroll records. Title III provided federal grants to states for unemployment compensation administration, while unemployment benefits themselves depended on state systems built within federal guidelines. This federal-state arrangement helped the law survive politically and constitutionally, but it also preserved uneven administration. Benefit levels, waiting periods, and coverage details could vary by state, leaving geography as part of the lived reality of economic security. The exclusions were built in from the start. Agricultural labor and domestic service, two sectors heavily populated by Black workers in the South and by women nationwide, were initially excluded from old age insurance and unemployment coverage under the most significant provisions. Southern Democrats held crucial committee power and supported a New Deal that would not disrupt the racial labor order on which segregation rested. Employers also favored narrower definitions that reduced tax burdens and administrative complexity. Paper categories carried racial and gender consequences. A worker could labor full-time and still remain outside the legal definition of covered employment. Benefits also unfolded gradually. State unemployment offices had to be created, staffed, and funded before claims could be processed. Old age insurance required payroll reporting and administrative buildup before monthly benefits reached full operation. Between 1935 and 1940, the law changed expectations immediately, while changing lived household income more unevenly through staged implementation. Security arrived through offices, forms, and state implementation schedules rather than through instant uniform payment. Labor rights expanded through the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, better known as the Wagner Act after Senator Robert F. Wagner of New York. The law declared that employees had the right to organize, join unions, bargain collectively, and engage in concerted activities for mutual aid. It identified unfair labor practices by employers, including interfering with union activity, dominating company unions, discriminating against union supporters, and refusing to bargain with representatives chosen by workers. The National Labor Relations Board became the enforcement body, holding representation elections and issuing remedies. Meanwhile, the Congress of Industrial Organizations moved aggressively into autos, steel, rubber, and electrical manufacturing, using the law as part of a larger drive to organize mass production workers. The CIO campaigns demonstrated how legal recognition and shop floor pressure reinforced one another. John L. Lewis backed industrial unionism on the premise that mass production workers could not be organized plant by plant through old craft lines. The 1936-1937 Flint sit-down strike at General Motors forced national attention onto the question of bargaining rights, while U.S. Steel's 1937 decision to recognize the Steel Workers Organizing Committee showed that major corporations now had to calculate under a different legal environment. NLRB procedures, regional offices, election certifications, and unfair labor practice complaints gave workers a federal venue. But strikes, picket lines, and local police confrontations still shaped the outcome on the ground. The court struggle sharpened every design choice. After Schechter Poultry in 1935 and United States versus Butler in 1936, New Dealers had reason to fear that social insurance and labor regulation could be invalidated as well. Roosevelt's court plan, announced in February 1937, proposed adding a justice for each sitting justice over 70 who did not retire, up to 6 additional seats. Critics treated it as a direct attempt to alter the court for policy ends, and many congressional Democrats recoiled even while supporting New Deal substance. The plan failed legislatively, but in the same year, the court upheld the Wagner Act in NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Corp. and sustained key Social Security provisions in Stewart Machine Comey v. Davis and Halvering v. Davis, fixing the later New Deal on firmer constitutional ground. When Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act in August 1935, the promise of security was written in ledgers, payroll deductions, and covered categories, rather than in a universal guarantee. Old age insurance depended on wage records and employer-worker contributions. Unemployment compensation fused a federal payroll tax to state administrative systems. The statutory language was built for clerks, tax collectors, employment offices, and account books. Security would exist only where the state could classify, collect, and pay. Set beside the Wagner Act of the same year, the writing becomes even more strategic. New dealers were trying to stabilize workers after layoffs and old age, but they were also trying to alter power while people were still on the job. The Wagner Act barred employer interference with organizing, prohibited sham company unions, required bargaining with certified representatives, and gave the NLRB authority to investigate complaints and supervise elections. That was federal power entering the factory gate by way of procedure. The procedural detail was the point. A worker needed more than sympathy in a depression economy. He or she needed a recognized bargaining unit, an election record, an enforceable board order, and some expectation that unemployment compensation or old age benefits would exist if wages disappeared. The law made insecurity administrative, then tried to manage it administratively. Flint in 1936 and 1937 showed how much conflict still sat inside that effort. Sit-down strikers used direct action to force recognition, while the federal government built a legal arena capable of ratifying or constraining the results. The court struggle in 1937 exposed how contingent the whole project remained. After the Supreme Court struck down the NIRA and the first CHIP-OA, Roosevelt feared that social insurance and labor law could be next. His February 1937 judicial reorganization plan opened a political war over the court itself. The plan collapsed, yet the court upheld the Wagner Act in NLRB v. Jones and Laughlin Steel Corp. and sustained key Social Security provisions in Halvering v. Davis and Stewart Machine Company v. Davis. The ink on those decisions kept the welfare and labor state alive, but the structure that survived was still bounded by exclusions for many agricultural and domestic workers, by Southern racial bargains, and by a constitutional order that had accepted the system without promising to extend it equally. The consequences of the later New Deal were foundational. Old age insurance became one of the most durable federal commitments in American history. Unemployment compensation established that job loss in a mass industrial economy could trigger lawful support, and the Wagner Act accelerated industrial unionism in steel, auto, rubber, and other mass production sectors. Federal responsibility for economic life became much harder to reverse after 1935. Those gains expanded through later law. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set a federal minimum wage, maximum hours for covered workers, and child labor restrictions in interstate commerce. Together with Social Security and the Wagner Act, it placed federal floors under wage labor and household insecurity. Citizens increasingly judged Washington by whether it could shield families from market collapse and employers from using unchecked authority over workers. The exclusions remained central to the system's design. Domestic and agricultural workers stayed outside key protections at the start, and the reliance on formal wage records and recognized employment relationships favored workers easiest for the state to count, tax, and supervise. Informal labor, seasonal labor, unpaid care work, and racially segmented labor markets were never accidental leftovers. They were part of the compromise that made the system politically possible. That is the unresolved inheritance. The later New Deal built the central pillars of the American welfare and labor state, yet it embedded hierarchy inside those pillars from the beginning. The hard civic choice it leaves behind is whether a security system that protects millions but excludes whole categories of workers should be judged mainly by the shelter it created or by the inequalities it made durable through law.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.